The government introduced new legislation yesterday which seeks to settle the migrant crisis once and for all. And there are reasonable people on all sides of this debate. There are valid reasons for being both for and against this policy. But a certain individual at the BBC, who I'm told by my team is significant for one reason or another, and goes by the name, I think, of Gary Lineker, thought it was appropriate to compare the new legislation to Nazi Germany. Now, a rule of public life is never compare anything to Nazi Germany. It's always silly. But I believe in freedom of speech, so I have no objection to his freedom to express his views. The only issue is, does he represent the state broadcaster, which chooses to pay Mr. Gary Lineker, who I understand used to play association football, over £1 million a year? Meanwhile, they recently made the calamitous decision to close the UK's only full-time professional chamber choir, BBC Singers. Shouldn't they spend the money on that rather than Mr. Linklater? Anyway, never mind what I think. Vox populi, vox Dei. We asked the people if Gary Lineker was wrong to compare this new policy to Nazi Germany, and the people, you have spoken.
No, that's not an accurate comparison. We're not killing people in gas chambers, no. No, personally, I think the government can't win either way. I mean, there is clearly a problem with illegal immigration.
Gary Lineker clearly has a view, the government have a different view, and I guess for me it's a bit too early to say. I don't really fully understand the bill.
I think he's a complete idiot. I mean, you know, he's entitled to his opinion, obviously, but anyone who knows anything about history and the history of that period knows it's a completely meaningless comparison. It's just ignorant.
Joined now by my esteemed panel, the former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, and the Labour MP, Lloyd Russell-Moyle. Lloyd, I'll let you go first. Do you want to defend Mr. Lindbaum?
Well, Gary Lineker, who I think is a pretty, good football commentator, although I know as much about football as you do, probably.
So reassuring. Two politicians who don't pretend to know about football. It's very rare.
I have a Premier League club in my constituency. I wish them all the best, and that is that. But I think he's entitled to those views. The BBC do not employ him to be a political correspondent. They don't employ him to be a news gatherer. That's not his job. His job is to commentate on football. If he was making stupid comparisons about football, maybe that would put him into challenge with his work. I don't think it does, because that's not what he's employed for. Football is an entertainment, and he is a commentator on entertainment. So that is, in my view, fine. Do I agree with the content of what he said? No, I agree with you. Goodwin's law says that if you're losing the argument and you're spending too much time on online forums, you tend to compare everything to the Nazis and Hitler, and it's best not to fulfil Goodwin's law. And so I think the parallels are rather foolish. I do think there are some parallels instead about Britain's treatment historically. Why did Britain initiate the Refugee Convention and we created it with others after the Second World War? Because we were embarrassed about our treatment of the Jews in the 1930s, that we didn't allow people in when in hindsight we realised that they were facing huge persecutions. And in the cold light of day, we created that treaty to say we know that these moments will come again when tough times come along, economic times, global war times, and we need something written down now that draws the balance correct. And I think the Refugee Convention still does that. The problem that we have with the law is that there aren't any legal routes for people to actually apply for asylum in this country at the moment.
Let's get back to that, but Kelvin, I want to bring you in on the issue of the BBC. It's true that he's not contracted to the BBC, he's not presenting the
No, but there is a yes.
Does it really matter?
I know what this argument is, actually. Within the BBC, there is a line about social media, right, in which they say that if you embarrass us, then we have a problem. And where they have a problem is this, that they have somebody whose fame is completely tied up, right? He's moved on from football. He's completely tied up with the BBC. He's a front... And Walker's Crisp. He is completely tied up with whether he's fronting up the World Cup or he's doing some sports night awards ceremony or he's doing Match of the Day, which he's done for 20 years. I'm sure he does it perfectly all right, but it's a video goal show. Anybody can do it. And therefore, when he says something, it has an impact. Why? Not because he's Gary Lineker, the ex-footballer, but because he's Gary Lineker, he's on the screen, and he's being funded. His pay is being funded by us. So this is what I would suggest to the viewer, that the way that they could hurry up Tim Davies' decision to get rid of him is simply say, we are not going to pay the 159 quid until he goes. He's entitled to say his stuff, but don't say his stuff when he's employed by the BBC.
Do you then bar anyone at the BBC saying any political beliefs? You know, kind of when Diane and
Nick
Portillo
Robinson said that this morning on the Today programme.
Diane and Portillo were on the sofa on that programme, and they were politicians, but they were paid by the BBC to sit on that sofa. Would you say they weren't allowed? No, because that would have devoided.
In the same way that Jacob is entitled to a view, and you're entitled to your view, because that's what you are actually paid to do. He is paid to give his views, either, as you point out, about crisps or about whether a goal goes in. Now, he has chosen, and I admire him for this, to have a view outside that. But because he is so famous, that view carries way beyond just...
Isn't the issue not about him, but about how the BBC is funded, and that the BBC has this requirement for impartiality because it is state-funded. If the licence fee were got rid of, nobody would mind what a former footballer said.
Correct.
It would be completely... So the fundamental issue isn't what he says, isn't the fact that he's on the BBC.
Correct.
It's that the BBC is the state broadcaster and funded by a tax on everybody,
so
and that should go.
So if he went to work for BT Sport, or he became the breakfast show for TalkSport, my old shop, absolutely, he could say what he likes as long as the management are prepared to put up with it.
Lloyd, I would like to see the licence fee go. I think that it's an anachronism, and it's very few things that I think are an anachronism. Normally I'm in favour of them. But you want to keep it.
Well, I think it should be reformed. I personally would put it as a slice on everyone's internet bill, and I would get rid of the criminalisation around the licence fee and just have it as something that the internet companies collect when you pay your internet bill. And I would do that because the BBC is more than a TV station. It is a basic news provider. It does the core of local news now, because that has been hollowed out for many reasons, partly because advertising has dried up in the local news field, and it provides those kinds of services. Now, I'm willing to have a discussion about should it focus on certain services rather than other services that it's doing at the moment. I think that's a legitimate discussion, but I do think there is a role for a baseline inform, entertain and educate service. And we saw that during the pandemic in terms of schooling programme as well, which the BBC helped to roll out. I think that is important, and I think it's important that is paid for by the public on a mass basis.
I think we can do that commercially on GBNews, but Kelvin, you once had a proposal that people should get a share in the BBC if they were licence fee payers.
Yes, and in the same way as Waitrose and John Lewis are run, or not run, actually, run rather poorly, actually, but that if we are going to be... It's the idea that we are forced to pay for something which... You know, to give Tim Davie his credit, I read a speech of his the other day. He said, "Yeah, we get better value than some of the commercial operators," and I do salute some of the way they squeeze money out. But at the same time, we have got to the point where if you shut it down tomorrow, there will be a huge opportunity for other people in the online world. Owning a television station is not the expense that it was 20 years ago. It used to cost you a fortune. Now, literally, if you have a phone and you have a mic, you can go have an online streaming service.
I have a local television
We're doing a bit
station.
better than that. We've got a bit more than a phone and a mic. But thank you very much to Lloyd and Kelvin.